So now we've got this broad picture that is very much looking like a sort of project of the Enlightenment, where we see Kant as trying to unify the treatment of behavior in two different domains in the same way that Galileo and Newton are unifying celestial and terrestrial mechanics under a common treatment. And it's a useful way to think about, I think, the project that Kant's got going on here. So, how are we going to be treating rational behavior, practical reason? What are the analogies to the treatment of physical behavior? Well, where we had exceptionless universal laws over there in the physical realm, and they, of course, apply to all rational creatures because they're physically embodied. Right? We also now have imperatives. Imperatives are these expressions of rational commands, rational necessity, and those will operate as the analogous structures to scientific laws in the practical realm. So there are two general classes of these things, hypothetical imperatives. And hypothetical imperatives, as you'll see, Kant actually breaks them into two groups, and understanding why, I think you get an insight into hypothetical imperatives. But a hypothetical imperative generally, it expresses the practical necessity, a command of reason, of some possible action as a means to achieving something else that one wants or might want. So they are means-ends relationships. They are expressions that say, look, if you want this, you ought to act this way. If you desire that, then you ought to do this. So they connect an end, a goal, to a means, an action. And they do so in a way that is a command of reason. Categorical imperatives are also imperatives, and they command, just like hypothetical imperatives do, but they represent an action as being objectively necessary without linking it to some goal or end, right? So the action is objectively necessary in itself without regard to any other end. So hypothetical imperatives are always going to have the structure of relating a goal and end to a means. Categorical imperatives will always have the structure of just dictating an action as objectively necessary. So how's that supposed to work? To get a handle on this, let's look at an example of a hypothetical imperative. Let's look at a Homerian hypothetical imperative. It's Friday night. Homer's got a goal. I want to get drunk. He's got a hypothetical imperative. If you want to get drunk, you ought to drink a bunch of duff. And the Homerian hypothetical imperative impels him, I know it's pretty generous to call it rational action, to take this action to accomplish that goal. That's how hypothetical imperatives are supposed to work in Kant's mind. Right? So if you want to get drunk, you ought to drink beer. There's a Homerian hypothetical imperative. Now, there are two kinds, two flavors of hypothetical imperative that Kant wants to talk about. And Rachel's doesn't make this distinction in the readings, but I think it's an important distinction because it helps you understand what it is that Kant's trying to do in the ethical theory, what's so special about the categorical imperatives. So, problematic hypothetical imperatives, they're commands of reason. They assert a practical necessity, right? But what they do is they link some action. They say that you ought to do this to accomplish some purpose. So they address themselves to a problem, right? And sometimes Kant, for that reason, calls them imperatives of skill. Now, problematic hypothetical imperatives, they are these commands of reason, but they don't look like they're universal practical necessities in the way that the law of universal gravitational attraction is a physical necessity, right? And why? Well, part of the reason why is that hypothetical imperatives, they are ways that link means to ends, where the ends aren't ends held by all rational creatures, much less all rational creatures at all times in their existence. So this is where the Homerian hypothetical imperative comes into play here, right? So if you want to get drunk and you live in the fictitious world where there's Duff beer, then you will be impelled by your recognition of the practical necessity of the hypothetical imperative. It will cause you to behave. It will exercise your will, right? If you don't have that goal, say it's Monday morning, you're not Homer, et cetera, you don't like beer. All of these things are ways in which that Homeric hypothetical imperative doesn't apply to all rational creatures. And so, Kant says that doesn't look like the sort of law of universal gravitational acceleration, for example, right? That unrestrained objects let loose in the gravitational field will accelerate at 9.8 meters per second. That doesn't look like the Homerian hypothetical imperative doesn't look like that, because not all rational creatures have that goal. They don't have it at all times. Hence, it doesn't look like practical necessity, the sort of necessity that is the corresponding analogous kind of necessity to physical necessity. Doesn't mean they're not useful, doesn't mean they don't cause rational action. It just means that they're not the candidate for bringing about moral behavior through duty. Next candidate. So we think about those hypothetical imperatives and we say, hey, okay, I understand not everybody wants to get drunk and not everybody wants to get drunk all the time and so on. So these aren't universal ends, hence it doesn't have a unrestrained scope, this imperative. But some goals all rational creatures have, and they have them all the time. Right? So an assertoric hypothetical imperative says that an action is good for well-being. Right? So rational creatures in Kant's mind, they all have as a goal, they all desire well-being. They want to be happy and healthy. They want to be self-fulfilled, things of that nature. They always have those goals. That's part of what it is to be a rational being in his mind. And hence, these, right, these look sort of more genuinely like practical necessity, like something that would correspond to the law, Newton's law of gravitational attraction. And Kant calls these pragmatic imperatives. So since all rational beings have well-being as an end, assertoric hypothetical imperatives might seem like the sort of universal exceptionless commands of reason, i.e. laws, that Kant says are responsible for acting or getting us to act from duty. However, he rejects assertoric hypothetical imperatives as having moral power. And why is that? Well, he says, look, everybody has these goals, but they don't create a universal deterministic behavior, right? They don't work to make the world practical behavior unfold, rational behavior unfold in this universal exceptionless way. They don't have normative force to them in the way that a moral command ought to have. And so what's his reason for that? Well, he says, look, assertoric imperatives, they still relate means to ends. They seem more like exceptionless universal laws because the ends are always held by human beings, rational agents. However, Kant says, there's real problems with these as determining rational behavior in the sort of rigid way that I want moral duties to do. And the problem with it is he says, look, everybody has this end of well-being or happiness, but that concept is so indefinite, right? And remember when I was talking about criticisms of utilitarianism, I mentioned Kant's criticism of utilitarianism, and this is part and parcel with that, right? This idea that, well, look, happiness doesn't actually look like an accomplishment or a goal. It's not something you go to the store and buy a six-pack of. It's not something that you can measure using the happyometer, or et cetera, et cetera. And so he thinks it's indefinite. Right? It looks more like it's something that happens as a reaction to our behaviors, as opposed to things something we can actually bring about. That's a problem. It's not a determinate end, and so even though people have it, right, it's not clear that they have the same thing. In addition to that, he says, look, the means to achieving this are variable. Right? So for some people, right, ice cream makes them happy. For other people, like people who have dairy allergies, no way. Ice cream makes them very, very unhappy. Right? So the means for bringing about happiness are variable across rational agents. And so that doesn't look like a universal law in the way that gravity is. Everything has mass, hence everything is attracted to everything else in accordance with the principle of universal gravitational attraction. Everything desires happiness, but exactly what that is unclear and can vary from person to person, and how they go about trying to get it, whether it's eating ice cream or traveling or buying fancy cars, right? Whatever it is they're doing, it's not going to be uniform. So, again, doesn't look like the sort of practical necessity that's this corresponding notion that's correlative to physical necessity. Hence, right, doesn't look like these imperatives are going to be candidates for the sort of things that are exception as universal commands, and hence he calls them imperatives that provide only counsel or advice. So hypothetical imperatives, sure, they're commands of reason, sure, they can guide behavior, right? They guide behavior with this mechanism of our recognition of the command of reason at the rational necessity, but not going to count as things that cause us to act from duty. So what might be an example of an assertoric hypothetical imperative? Well, here I jacked up Yoda. Can give us an example of a hypothetical or assertoric hypothetical imperative. Exercise 20 minutes, 2 or 3 times a week you ought, if healthy you wish to be. Right? So that's reasonably good advice, right? But it's not exceptionalist advice. Right? So if you've got an existing severe coronary condition, do not go out and exercise for 20 minutes. You'll likely cause yourself to have a heart attack. Right? Exercising 20 minutes 2 or 3 times a week, if you start off healthy, will, right, increase your cardiovascular health, delay the onset of any cardiovascular disease. It will also, in many cases, reduce your risks of certain cancers, but it doesn't prevent cancer, it doesn't prevent joint disease, just not the sort of thing that Kant has in mind when he's thinking about practical necessity as in acting from duty.